Forward. They thought betraying you would make their life easier. They thought distance would give them freedom. Forward. They thought walking away meant they had finally escaped the emotional pressure they felt inside the relationship. But there is a part of the story they may never have expected. Forward. Sometimes the person an avoidant pushes away does not stay available forever. And when that person finally stops chasing, stops explaining, stops asking for answers, forward, and genuinely moves on, the emotional consequences can begin much later than anyone expected. This is where the story becomes psychologically interesting. Forward. Because the most painful consequence is not always losing the relationship itself. Forward. It can be the realization that the person they once had access to is no longer emotionally available to them. The person who once waited for a message may stop checking their phone. Forward. The person who once wanted an explanation may stop needing one. The person who once tried to repair every argument may finally decide that there is nothing left to repair. Forward. And that change can expose something the avoidant may have been successfully avoiding for a very long time. Forward. Avoidant attachment is often connected with discomfort around emotional closeness, vulnerability, dependence, and intense relationship conflict. Forward. For some people with strong avoidant patterns, closeness can feel good at one moment and threatening at another. They may want connection, forward, but when the relationship becomes emotionally intense, their defenses can become stronger. They may need more space. They may become distant. Forward. They may focus heavily on the problems in the relationship. They may convince themselves that their feelings are weaker than they really are. In psychology, forward, this kind of emotional downplaying is often discussed as deactivation. The mind reduces the importance of attachment needs because those needs feel uncomfortable or unsafe. Forward. That is why betrayal can sometimes look strangely calm from the outside. A person may lie, withdraw, keep another person as an option, break promises, cheat, forward, or create emotional distance without appearing deeply affected by what they are doing. They may act cold. They may seem relieved. Forward. They may even behave as though the relationship was never that important. But behavior in the moment does not always reveal the full emotional process happening underneath it. Forward. And this is one of the lesser known parts of avoidant psychology. Emotional suppression is not the same thing as emotional absence. Forward. A person can push a feeling away without actually resolving it. They can convince themselves that they are fine. They can stay busy. They can focus on work, friends, forward, another relationship, entertainment, or anything else that keeps them from sitting with uncomfortable emotions. They can tell themselves that leaving was the correct choice. Forward. They can create a mental list of every reason the relationship was difficult. They can focus on your mistakes while ignoring their own contribution to the breakdown. For a while, forward, this can work. The emotional pressure decreases. The difficult conversations stop. The expectations disappear. Forward. The responsibility of being emotionally present seems to disappear with them. Distance can therefore feel like freedom. Forward. But freedom from emotional pressure is not always the same as freedom from emotional consequences. That distinction matters. Forward. Because the person who was betrayed may eventually change the entire dynamic without making a dramatic announcement. They may simply stop participating in it. Forward. No more long explanations. No more repeated attempts to understand mixed signals. No more begging for reassurance. No more trying to prove their value. Forward. No more accepting behavior that repeatedly breaks trust. And once that happens, the avoidant may lose something they did not realize they were relying on: access to attention, forward, access to reassurance, access to emotional availability, access to someone who understood them, access to someone who kept the connection alive even when they created distance, forward. This does not mean every avoidant will suddenly experience regret. It does not mean every person with avoidant attachment will return, forward. And it certainly does not mean that every betrayal leads to some dramatic psychological collapse. People are different. Attachment style is not a diagnosis, forward. Avoidant behavior can have many causes, and one relationship cannot tell us everything about a person's psychology. Some people genuinely leave because a relationship is unhealthy, forward. Some people recognize their mistakes and change. Others repeat the same patterns in relationship after relationship, forward. So this is not a story about labeling every avoidant person as cruel or emotionally damaged, forward. It is about understanding a specific psychological pattern, a pattern where emotional closeness creates discomfort. Distance creates relief, forward. Relief creates the belief that leaving was the solution. Then, much later, the absence of the other person creates a completely different emotional experience, forward. And that delayed reaction is where things can become complicated. At first, the avoidant may feel almost nothing. They may seem completely unaffected, forward. They may continue with their normal life. They may even look happier. From the outside, it can seem like they made the decision easily and never looked back, forward. But human attachment does not always follow the timeline of conscious decisions. A person can decide to leave today and emotionally process the loss months later, forward. Sometimes the mind does not fully register what has been lost while the relationship is still available. The person is still there. The possibility of contact still exists, forward. The door has not completely closed. So the nervous system can maintain a sense that the connection is still accessible. Then something changes. The other person moves on. Suddenly, forward, the old source of reassurance is no longer there. The messages stop. The emotional availability disappears. The familiar routine ends. There is no one waiting for another explanation, forward. There is no one trying to restart the same conversation. There is no one standing in the same emotional position. And that can force a different question into the avoidance mind, forward. Did I actually want freedom? Or did I simply want freedom from the discomfort that came with being emotionally close? Those are two very different things. The first is a genuine choice, forward. The second can be an escape. And when escape becomes permanent, the person who wanted distance may eventually discover that distance has a cost, forward. The real consequence is not necessarily that their life suddenly falls apart. It is something much quieter and more psychological, forward. They may begin to compare future connections with the one they lost. They may recognize qualities they once dismissed. They may remember moments they previously pushed aside, forward. They may begin to understand that the person they thought would always be available has built a life that no longer includes them. That is when betrayal can become a mirror, forward. The same decision that once felt like control can begin to feel like loss, forward. The same distance that once felt peaceful can begin to feel empty. And the person they believed they could walk away from may become the person they cannot simply replace. In this video, forward, we are going to break down exactly why that happens. We will look at why an avoidant may initially feel relief after betraying or pushing away someone, forward, why the emotional reaction can be delayed, and why the moment you stop chasing can completely change the psychological dynamic. Forward. We will also examine what happens when the avoidant starts remembering the relationship differently. Why regret can appear long after the betrayal. Forward. Why some avoidants attempt to reconnect, and why coming back does not automatically mean they have changed. Most importantly, forward, we will separate genuine emotional growth from simple fear of losing access to you. Forward. Because there is a major difference between someone missing you and someone becoming capable of loving you in a healthier way. By the end of this video, forward, you will understand why walking away peacefully can sometimes create a much stronger psychological impact than anger ever could. You will also understand why you do not need revenge, or manipulation, or another dramatic confrontation to make someone face the consequences of their choices. Sometimes the consequence is simply this: you stopped waiting. Forward. You stopped chasing. You stopped explaining. And you became unavailable to the same pattern that once kept you trapped. Forward. That is, when the person who thought they had escaped the relationship may finally have to face what their decision actually cost them. Welcome to the channel. Forward. If you want to understand the deeper psychology behind avoidant behavior, emotional withdrawal, attachment, betrayal, and relationship patterns, forward, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. Because in the next part, we are going to uncover why betrayal can initially feel like freedom to an avoidant, forward, and why that feeling may not last nearly as long as they expected, forward. For an avoidant person, betrayal can sometimes feel like an escape before it feels like a loss. That may sound strange, forward, especially when their actions have clearly hurt someone they once claimed to care about, forward. But the psychology behind avoidance is often less about a lack of emotion and more about how a person handles emotional pressure. When closeness begins to feel overwhelming, forward, the mind can start looking for a way out. The relationship may still matter, but the emotional intensity becomes difficult to tolerate. Vulnerability can feel dangerous. Forward. Dependence can feel uncomfortable. The possibility of rejection can create anxiety. Even losing personal freedom can feel threatening. Forward. So instead of moving closer and working through those feelings, an avoidant may create distance. At first, that distance can feel incredibly calming. The difficult conversations stop. Forward. The emotional expectations become quieter. There is less pressure to explain feelings. There is less need to respond to another person's emotional needs. Forward. The person suddenly has more space, and their nervous system may interpret that space as safety. Forward. This is one reason an avoidant can appear surprisingly calm after creating a major rupture. They may not feel the loss immediately because the first emotional experience is relief. Forward. The pressure has decreased, so the brain registers the change as positive. But relief is not the same as happiness. Forward. And relief is certainly not proof that the relationship meant nothing. This is where deactivation becomes important. In attachment psychology, forward, deactivation refers to mental strategies that reduce awareness of attachment needs. A person may start telling themselves that they never needed the relationship. Forward. They may focus intensely on small flaws. A habit that once seemed harmless suddenly becomes unbearable. A minor disagreement becomes evidence that the entire relationship was wrong. Forward. Positive memories may become less accessible, while negative memories become easier to recall. The person may mentally rewrite the relationship until leaving feels completely justified. Forward. This can happen without the person consciously deciding to manipulate anyone. The mind can protect itself automatically. Forward. That is one of the more surprising parts of avoidant behavior. A person may genuinely believe the story they are telling themselves in that moment. Forward. They may believe they are simply being rational. They may say the relationship was too demanding. They may say they felt trapped. They may say they needed freedom. Forward. They may convince themselves that the emotional connection was never as deep as the other person believed. Yet their behavior before the withdrawal may tell a different story. Forward. They may have opened up deeply at certain moments. They may have wanted affection. They may have felt safe enough to share personal fears. Forward. They may have enjoyed closeness until the relationship became emotionally intense. Then the same connection that once felt comforting can begin to feel threatening. This creates a painful contradiction. They want connection, but they also fear what connection requires. They want to be loved, but they may become uncomfortable when someone gets close enough to truly know them. They want independence, but they can still feel deeply affected when someone becomes unavailable. When betrayal enters this pattern, it can become a psychological escape route. Instead of saying, I am scared of how close this relationship has become, the person may create a situation that forces distance. Instead of admitting, I feel vulnerable, they may become cold. Instead of communicating discomfort, they may withdraw. In more damaging situations, they may seek attention somewhere else, keep another person as an option, lie about their behavior, or break trust in a way that makes emotional closeness almost impossible to restore. The betrayal then serves a psychological function. It creates separation. And separation creates relief. That does not excuse the behavior. Understanding the mechanism is not the same as defending the choice. Betrayal can cause serious emotional damage, and the person who was betrayed is not responsible for fixing the avoidant person's attachment patterns. But understanding this pattern explains why the betrayer looks so unaffected. They may actually be experiencing a short-term reduction in emotional pressure. The relationship no longer demands vulnerability. The difficult emotions have been pushed away. The person can return to a familiar sense of independence. For a while, this can feel like freedom. Then comes the problem. The brain can reduce emotional awareness, but it cannot simply erase the history of attachment. A person can suppress thoughts about someone. They can avoid conversations. They can stay busy. They can create new routines. They can even start another relationship. But none of these things automatically resolve the emotions underneath the avoidance. This is the difference between emotional relief and emotional resolution. Relief says, I do not feel the pressure anymore. Resolution says, I understand what I felt, why I acted this way, and I have dealt with it. Those are completely different psychological states. An avoidant can experience the first without ever reaching the second. And that creates the first major twist in this story. The fact that they feel relieved after betraying you does not necessarily mean they stopped caring about you. It may mean they finally created enough distance to stop feeling the emotions they were struggling to handle. For a while, that can feel like winning. But the emotional cost can remain hidden while the other person is still available. As long as the door is still open, the avoidant may unconsciously believe that the connection can be recovered whenever they want. There is still access. There is still familiarity. Forward. There is still the possibility of contact. That changes when the other person stops chasing. And when that happens, forward, the relief that once came from distance can begin to collide with something much harder to avoid. Permanent loss. Forward. There is a moment in many difficult relationships when the entire dynamic changes without a dramatic argument. No final speech is needed. No angry message is required. Forward. The change begins when one person simply stops chasing. They stop asking why. They stop trying to decode every silence. They stop sending another message after being ignored. Forward. They stop trying to repair a relationship that only one person seems willing to repair. And for someone with strong avoidant patterns, forward, that change can feel very different from anything that happened before. Forward. This is where the pursuer-distancer cycle becomes important. One person feels uncertainty and reaches for reassurance. The other person feels pressure and pulls away. Forward. The more one person reaches, the more the other may retreat. The more the other retreats, the more anxious the first person becomes. Soon, forward, both people are reacting to each other instead of responding calmly to what the relationship actually needs. The strange part is that this cycle can continue for a very long time. Forward. The person being pushed away may keep trying because they believe one more conversation will finally fix things. They may explain their feelings again. They may ask for clarity. Forward. They may give another chance. They may become more patient. They may try to prove that they are safe, loyal, understanding, and willing to stay. From the outside, forward, this can look like devotion. Psychologically, however, it can also keep the old pattern alive. Every time the avoidant withdraws and the other person comes running back, forward, the emotional system receives the same message. Distance creates space, but connection is still available whenever they decide to return. Forward. The avoidant does not have to fully confront the consequences of pulling away because the other person keeps the relationship emotionally alive. Then one day, that stops. Forward. The messages stop. The explanations stop. The emotional negotiations stop. And that silence can be far more powerful than another argument. Not because silence is a manipulation tactic. Forward. It is not. Healthy silence is not about making someone panic or trying to force them to come back. Forward. It is what happens when a person finally accepts that they cannot carry a relationship alone. That acceptance changes the emotional structure. Forward. The avoidant may have become accustomed to having a certain amount of access to the other person. They may have known that even after a painful disagreement, forward, there would probably be another conversation. They may have expected another attempt at reconciliation. They may have believed that the person would eventually soften. Forward. Then there is nothing. No emotional rescue, no repeated reassurance, no familiar reaction. And suddenly, the avoidant has to experience the absence instead of controlling the distance. Forward. That difference is enormous. Forward. Choosing distance can feel safe because the person making the choice controls it. They decide when to respond. They decide when to disappear. Forward. They decide how much closeness feels comfortable. They can move forward and backward whenever they want. Losing access is completely different. Now the decision is no longer theirs. Forward. The other person has made a decision too, and that can activate emotions that were easier to avoid when the relationship was still available. Forward. This is one reason delayed emotional reactions can be so confusing. A person may appear unaffected immediately after the breakup or betrayal. Weeks or months can pass. Forward. Then something small brings the relationship back into awareness. A familiar place, a date, a song, a routine, a memory, a mutual friend mentioning the person's name. Suddenly, forward, the emotional response feels stronger than expected. This does not happen to every avoidant person. Attachment patterns are not simple formulas. People process loss differently. Forward. But delayed emotional processing is a real feature of human relationships, especially when someone has spent a long time pushing uncomfortable feelings away. Forward. The mind can postpone emotional processing. It cannot guarantee that the feelings will never return. And distractions can only work for so long. A busy schedule can fill the day. Forward. A new relationship can create excitement. Social attention can create temporary validation. Work can provide something else to focus on. But eventually, quiet moments appear. Forward. That is often when the difference between distraction and healing becomes clear. A person can be surrounded by people and still notice that one particular connection is missing. Forward. And there is another psychological shift that can happen when the other person genuinely moves forward. The old version of them disappears. Forward. The person who once responded immediately may now take no interest. The person who once needed an explanation may no longer care about receiving one. Forward. The person who once wanted to be chosen may have stopped asking to be chosen. That can create a painful contradiction for the avoidant. They wanted distance. Now they have it. Forward. But the distance no longer feels like freedom because the person on the other side of that distance is no longer waiting. Forward. This is the point where the meaning of the betrayal can begin to change. At first, the avoidant may have thought, I needed space. Forward. Later, the thought can become, they really left. Those statements sound similar, but emotionally, they are worlds apart. The first contains control. The second contains loss. Forward. And loss becomes much harder to dismiss when the person you assumed would always be available becomes emotionally unavailable to you. That is when the old certainty can begin to crack. Forward. The avoidant may start wondering whether the person has truly moved on. They may become curious about their life. They may check for signs of change. Forward. They may remember moments they previously minimized. They may begin to recognize that the relationship did not simply end because of circumstances. Forward. Their own choices helped create the ending. And that realization becomes especially powerful when there is no longer anyone standing there to argue with them about it. Forward. The person they pushed away is gone from the old emotional position. There is no longer anyone chasing them back into the relationship. There is only the silence left behind. Forward. And sometimes silence does not create the emotion. It simply removes enough noise for the emotion that was already there to finally be heard. Forward. There is a major difference between knowing someone is gone and actually feeling their absence. An avoidant person may understand the breakup from the beginning. Forward. They may know the relationship has ended. They may know the other person is no longer calling. They may even say that they are perfectly fine. Forward. But understanding a loss intellectually is not the same as emotionally processing it. The mind can accept a fact long before the emotions catch up with that fact. Forward. This is where delayed grief becomes important. Not every avoidant experiences delayed grief. Not every person with avoidant traits reacts in the same way. Forward. Attachment patterns are not rigid rules. But when someone has a strong habit of pushing uncomfortable emotions away, emotional processing can sometimes happen later. Forward. The person may stay busy. They may focus on work. They may start dating again. They may tell themselves that leaving was necessary. They may avoid places, conversations, forward, and thoughts connected to the relationship. For a while, the loss can remain strangely distant. Then ordinary life starts bringing it back, forward. A familiar song can suddenly trigger a memory. A certain restaurant can remind them of an old conversation. A routine they once shared can feel different when they are doing it alone, forward. A phrase you used often can appear in their mind without warning, forward. Even something as simple as checking their phone can remind them that there is no longer a message from you waiting there. These moments can seem insignificant. Psychologically, forward, they are not always insignificant. Human memory is strongly connected to context. A person, place, sound, smell, routine, forward, or repeated experience can become linked with emotional memories. That means a relationship does not exist only in conscious thoughts, forward. It becomes connected to hundreds of small experiences throughout daily life, forward. That is why someone can seem completely fine for months and then suddenly feel something they thought they had already moved past, forward. The relationship was never stored as one single memory. It was woven into ordinary life. And when the person is gone, those small connections remain, forward. There is another shift that can happen during this stage. The way the avoidant remembers the relationship may begin to change. During the relationship, especially near the end, forward, they may have focused heavily on what was wrong. Every disagreement may have seemed larger. Every emotional request may have felt like pressure, forward. Every difference may have become another reason to create distance. This can be part of deactivation. When closeness feels threatening, forward, the mind may reduce the emotional importance of the relationship by focusing on its negative aspects, forward. The person may remember why the relationship was difficult more easily than why it was meaningful. But distance can change the balance of memory. Once the emotional pressure is gone, forward, the negative parts may lose some of their intensity. The person may start remembering other things, the way you made them laugh, the conversations that lasted for hours, forward, the moments when they felt understood, the support they received during a difficult period, the small routines that once seemed ordinary, forward. Things they ignored can suddenly become valuable. And that can create a confusing emotional experience. The person may not simply think, I miss them. They may begin thinking, forward, I did not realize how much those moments mattered. That is a much deeper realization. Missing someone is about absence, forward. Regret is about responsibility. Regret begins when the person connects the loss to their own choices. They may remember the moment they lied, the conversation they avoided, forward, the message they never answered, the chance they had to communicate honestly, but chose silence instead, forward. They may remember pushing the other person away while still expecting them to remain emotionally available. Then the past starts looking different, forward. The betrayal is no longer only something that happened. It becomes something they participated in. This is where guilt and regret can become very different from simple loneliness, forward. Loneliness says, I do not have this person anymore. Regret says, my actions helped cause this. That second realization can be much harder to escape, forward. Because there is no way to go back and make the original decision differently. A person can send a message. They can apologize. They can ask for another chance, forward. But they cannot erase the experience the other person went through. Trust that took years to build can be damaged in a moment, forward. And even a sincere apology does not guarantee that the other person will return. This is one of the hardest lessons for someone who assumed the door would remain open. Forward. They may have believed that the relationship could always be repaired later. Later can feel safe when someone is still available, but later is not guaranteed. The other person may heal. Forward. They may build a new routine. They may regain confidence. They may discover that life feels calmer without the old cycle. Forward. They may stop wondering why the avoidant behaved the way they did. They may no longer need an apology to move forward. And that is when the loss can become permanent in a way the avoidant never expected. The painful part is not simply losing access to a person. It is realizing that an opportunity existed. There was a real chance to build something deeper. There was a person who was willing to communicate, understand, forgive, and stay. There was a moment when the relationship could have taken a healthier direction, but the opportunity was not protected. It was damaged by choices. And now the person who once seemed so available may have changed beyond recognition. They may still remember the relationship, but they no longer want to return to it. They may still care, but caring does not mean reopening the door. They may forgive, but forgiveness does not require reconciliation. This is where the avoidant can face a painful psychological contradiction. They wanted the pressure to disappear. It did. They wanted emotional space. They received it. They wanted freedom from the difficult parts of the relationship. They got that too. But eventually they may realize that the same distance that removed the discomfort also removed the person. And now there is no argument to fix, no conversation to postpone. No emotional problem to escape. Only the reality that someone they once had is no longer standing in the same place. That is when regret can become heavier than missing them. Because missing someone makes you wish they were here. Regret makes you question the choices that made them leave. And once that question begins, the mind can return again and again to the same painful possibility. The person they pushed away may not have been the problem they needed to escape. The real problem may have been the pattern they carried into the relationship. And that pattern may have cost them something they cannot simply replace. At some point, the story can stop being about you and start becoming a story about them. This is where betrayal can become a mirror. The relationship is gone. The arguments are over. The other person is no longer there to defend themselves or explain what happened. And without that emotional noise, the avoidant may begin facing something much harder than losing the relationship. They may begin facing their own pattern. For a long time, it can be easier to blame the relationship. Maybe the relationship was too intense. Maybe the other person asked for too much. Maybe there was too much emotion. Maybe they felt trapped. Maybe they needed more independence. Maybe they simply believed that the two people were not compatible. Sometimes those things can be true. Some relationships really are unhealthy. Some people genuinely need to leave. But there is a major difference between leaving a relationship because it is wrong for you and repeatedly destroying closeness whenever vulnerability becomes uncomfortable. The difference can become much clearer after the relationship ends because the avoidant no longer has the relationship in front of them to blame. The same emotional pattern may appear again somewhere else. They may enter another relationship and feel comfortable at first. There is excitement. There is attention. There is less emotional risk. Everything feels easy because nobody has become deeply attached yet. Then closeness grows. The new person wants more emotional connection, more honesty, more consistency forward, more vulnerability. And suddenly the same discomfort appears. The urge to pull away returns. The need for space becomes stronger. Small problems start feeling enormous. Forward. The person begins questioning the relationship again. And this can create a disturbing realization. Maybe the problem was not only the previous relationship. Forward. Maybe the same pattern followed them. This is where self-protective beliefs can begin to collide with reality. I needed freedom, but now they are free. Forward. And they still feel something missing. I was happier alone, but being alone does not feel as peaceful as expected. They were too demanding. Forward. But another person makes similar requests, and the same discomfort appears. I just needed someone different. Then someone different comes along, and the same cycle begins again. Forward. These contradictions can force deeper questions. Why does closeness keep becoming threatening? Why does emotional intimacy feel easier at the beginning and harder later? Forward. Why does the desire for connection become strongest after distance has already been created? Why does the person seem more valuable after they are gone? Forward. These questions can be uncomfortable because they take away the easiest explanation. The relationship was not necessarily the entire problem. Forward. The pattern may have been part of the problem, and recognizing that can create several difficult emotions at once. There may be regret, there may be guilt, there may be shame. Forward. There may be sadness, there may even be anger directed inward. But these emotions are not all the same. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, something is wrong with me. Forward. That distinction matters. Healthy accountability allows a person to recognize harmful behavior without deciding that they are permanently broken. They can say, I hurt someone. Forward. I need to understand why I acted that way. I need to change how I handle closeness. Destructive shame goes somewhere else. It says, I ruin everything. I am incapable of love. Forward. I always destroy people. Forward. Those thoughts can create even more avoidance. The person feels bad about themselves, then escapes those feelings, then repeats the same behavior. Forward. So, genuine growth requires something more difficult than self-punishment. It requires accountability. That means facing the truth without hiding behind excuses. Forward. It means recognizing that fear may explain behavior, but fear does not erase responsibility. An avoidant pattern can help explain why someone withdrew. It does not justify betrayal. Forward. A person can have deep fears of vulnerability and still be responsible for how they treat another human being. Forward. That realization can become painful when the avoidant starts looking back at the relationship. They may remember moments when the other person was trying to get closer. Forward. Instead of receiving that closeness, they created distance. They may remember opportunities to communicate. Instead of speaking honestly, they disappeared. Forward. They may remember moments when the other person was offering patience. Instead of accepting that patience, they tested how far the other person would tolerate the emotional distance. Forward. And eventually, they may ask themselves a question that is difficult to answer. Why did I sabotage something I actually wanted? Forward. Because that is the deeper contradiction behind many avoidant patterns. The person may genuinely want love. They may want loyalty. They may want emotional safety. Forward. They may want someone who understands them. They may want a deep connection. But when that connection becomes real, the same person may become frightened by what they wanted. Forward. That is the paradox. They can crave intimacy while defending themselves against intimacy. They can want to be known while hiding their most vulnerable emotions forward. They can fear abandonment while pushing people away. They can want someone close while creating the conditions that eventually make closeness impossible forward. And betrayal can intensify that contradiction, because once trust is broken, the relationship may no longer provide the emotional safety that both people need forward. The avoidant may have created distance to protect themselves from vulnerability, but that distance can destroy the very connection that made vulnerability worth facing forward. This is why losing someone can become a mirror. The other person is no longer there to absorb the consequences. There is no longer someone constantly asking for reassurance forward. There is no longer someone trying to convince them to stay. There is no longer someone explaining why the behavior hurt. The avoidant may finally be left alone with the pattern itself forward. And the pattern does not disappear simply because the relationship does. That is one of the hardest truths to face. You can change the person. You can change the city forward. You can change the relationship. You can change the circumstances. But if the same emotional defense remains inside you, the same problem can eventually return forward. The person they betrayed may have been the first person who exposed that pattern clearly. They may have shown them what genuine closeness looked like forward. They may have offered the very emotional security the avoidant claimed to want. And yet, when that security became real, fear took over. Now the relationship is gone forward. The lesson remains. And sometimes the most painful part is realizing that the person they thought they needed to escape was never the only thing they were running from forward. They were also running from the parts of themselves that became visible when someone got close. And once that truth becomes impossible to ignore forward, the next question becomes even more difficult. If the relationship is gone and the pattern is still there, what happens when the avoidant starts wanting the person back forward? And once that truth becomes difficult to ignore, something unexpected can happen. The person who created the distance may begin wanting contact again. Not always immediately forward. Sometimes it happens weeks later. Sometimes months pass. In some cases, much longer forward. The timing can seem confusing because the person who once appeared certain about leaving may suddenly become curious about the person they pushed away forward. This can happen because attachment does not always disappear when contact ends. Distance can reduce emotional pressure forward, but it can also create space for feelings that were previously pushed aside. When the relationship was active, closeness may have triggered defensive reactions forward. After the relationship ends, those defenses may become less necessary. There is no immediate emotional demand. There is no difficult conversation happening in real time forward. There is simply the memory of the person, and memory can become powerful when access disappears forward. At first, the avoidant may have believed the relationship was over and that life would become easier. Then the silence continues. The other person does not return forward. There is no familiar message, no attempt to repair things, no sign that they are still waiting. That can create a completely different emotional experience forward. The person who once felt too close may suddenly feel very far away. This is where delayed attachment activation can sometimes appear forward. The emotional system may become more aware of the bond once the threat of closeness is gone. The person is no longer dealing with the pressure of intimacy forward. They are dealing with absence. And absence can make attachment feel louder. But there is an important detail here. Wanting contact again does not always mean the person has changed. Forward. There can be many reasons someone reaches out. Sometimes it is genuine regret. They may finally understand how deeply their actions hurt someone. Forward. They may recognize that they treated the relationship unfairly. They may wish they had communicated instead of withdrawing. Forward. They may feel responsible for the ending and want to repair some of the damage. Sometimes it is loneliness. The person may miss having someone who understood them. Forward. They may miss the comfort, attention, familiarity, and emotional support that came with the relationship. They may not necessarily be ready for the relationship itself. Forward. They may simply miss the emotional benefits that came with having that person in their life. Sometimes it is nostalgia. Nostalgia can make the past feel softer than it actually was. Forward. The difficult arguments may become less vivid. The emotional tension may fade from memory. The good moments become stronger. The laughter becomes clearer. Forward. The small routines become meaningful. Suddenly, the person remembers what they had instead of only remembering why they left. Another motivation can be fear of permanent loss. Forward. As long as the other person seemed available, there may have been an unconscious belief that the connection could be recovered later. But once that person truly moves forward, the possibility changes. There may be no later. That realization can create urgency. The avoidant may start wondering whether the door is still open. They may send a simple message. Forward. Hey, how have you been? It can look harmless. Forward. But sometimes a small message is not really about the words. It is about testing the emotional temperature. Will you respond quickly? Will you sound warm? Are you angry? Forward. Do you still care? Are you still available? A casual message can become a low-risk way to gather information without immediately exposing vulnerability. Forward. There can be other forms of re-engagement too. A sudden reaction to an old post, a brief check-in, a message about something that reminds them of the relationship. Forward. A mutual friend mentioning that they asked about you. Unexpected warmth after a long period of cold behavior. Sometimes the person may act as though nothing serious happened. Forward. They may casually restart communication instead of directly discussing the betrayal. This can be confusing for the person who was hurt because the message may create hope. Forward. But contact is not the same as change. That distinction is essential. Someone can miss you and still be unable to build a healthy relationship with you. Forward. Someone can regret losing you and still repeat the behavior that caused the loss. Someone can feel jealous when you move on and still not be emotionally ready to commit. Forward. Someone can become extremely warm after months of distance and then withdraw again when intimacy returns. Forward. That is why emotional intensity should never be confused with emotional maturity. A person may feel a powerful desire to come back because they fear losing you permanently. Forward. But once you are close again, the old discomfort may return. The cycle can restart. Closeness, pressure, withdrawal, disinstance, regret, return. Then the same pattern begins again. Forward. This is why the real question is not, do they miss me? The more important question is, can they behave differently now? Those are very different questions. Forward. Missing someone is an emotion. Building a healthy relationship is a skill. It requires communication. It requires honesty. It requires emotional responsibility. Forward. It requires the ability to tolerate discomfort without running from it. It requires accountability when harm has been caused. And most importantly, it requires consistency. Forward. Words can be emotional. Behavior is harder to fake over time. A person may say they have changed. They may apologize. They may say they finally understand your value. They may promise that everything will be different. Those words may even be sincere. But sincerity in one emotional moment does not prove lasting change. Real change becomes visible through repeated behavior. Do they respect your boundaries? Do they communicate when something feels uncomfortable? Do they take responsibility without blaming you? Do they stop disappearing whenever emotional pressure rises? Do they accept that rebuilding trust takes time? Do they understand that an apology does not automatically give them access to you again? These questions reveal far more than a dramatic declaration of love. And there is another important sign. A genuinely changed person does not demand immediate forgiveness. They understand that trust has consequences. If they cause the damage, they cannot control how quickly the other person heals. They cannot demand another chance simply because they finally understand what they lost. They have to accept the possibility that the other person may say no. That is where accountability becomes real. Because a person who only wants access will usually focus on getting the door reopened. A person who truly wants to repair the damage will focus on becoming someone who can be trusted behind that door. That difference can be difficult to see at first. The avoidant may return with warmth. They may sound nostalgic. They may say they have been thinking about you. They may suddenly remember all the good things. They may even admit that they made a mistake. But the real test comes later, when the relationship becomes emotionally close again. Do they remain present? When conflict appears, do they communicate? When vulnerability feels uncomfortable, do they stay? When you set a boundary, do they respect it? Because returning is easy compared with changing. Coming back can take one message. Becoming emotionally reliable can take months of consistent effort. And sometimes the person who returns is not returning because they are ready to love differently. Sometimes they are returning because they finally understand that you are no longer wanting. That is the moment the past can become very tempting. The door that once seemed permanently open may now be closing. And when someone realizes they may never get another chance, the question becomes impossible to avoid. Do they truly want to rebuild the relationship? Or do they simply want to make sure they have not lost you forever? Betrayal can create a sense of escape. It can make emotional pressure disappear for a while. It can make distance feel like freedom. But escaping discomfort does not erase emotional consequences. It only delays the moment when those consequences may need to be faced. An avoidant may believe that leaving means the difficult part is over. They may think they have regained control. They may believe the relationship was holding them back. But sometimes the true weight of the loss becomes clear only after the other person stops waiting. That is when the meaning of the relationship can change. The person they once took for granted is no longer available in the same way. The messages have stopped. The emotional reassurance is gone. The familiar connection is no longer guaranteed. And suddenly, the value of what they had may become much clearer. But there is something important to remember. You do not need to make someone suffer for them to face consequences. You do not need revenge. You do not need to prove your worth. You do not need to make them jealous. You do not need to create another emotional game just to make them regret losing you. natural consequences can be much more powerful. When you walk away with dignity, forward, rebuild your confidence, protect your peace, and refuse to repeat the same painful cycle, you change the only thing you can truly control, your own participation in the pattern. Forward. Maybe the avoidant regrets what happened. Maybe they never fully understand it. Maybe they reach out. Maybe they stay silent. Your healing and cannot depend on which one happens. Forward. Because the greatest victory is not watching someone regret losing you. It is reaching the point where their regret no longer determines your value. Forward. That is where the entire dynamic changes. The person who once chased answers stops needing them. The person who once waited stops waiting. Forward. The person who once tried desperately to be chosen finally realizes that love should not require constant proof of worth. And sometimes, forward, that is the moment the other person finally understands what they chose to lose. Not because you punished them, not because you destroyed their life, forward, but because you stopped destroying your own peace to keep the connection alive. The most powerful ending is not making someone regret betraying you, forward. It is becoming so emotionally free that their regret is no longer the reason you move forward. So, if this video helped you understand avoidant behavior in a deeper way, forward, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. There is much more to explore about attachment, emotional distance, betrayal, and the patterns that shape our relationships. Forward. And remember this, sometimes the moment you stop trying to be chosen is the moment someone finally realizes what they chose to lose. And by then, you may have already chosen yourself.